Hey guys, okay, so this is a quick run through of my talk, and I'm going to try to talk very quickly and try to be very economical in my presentation because I want this to be as close to 10 minutes as possible. Okay, so you can start your timers now. So in this commentary, I want to raise a couple of issues concerning Professor Audi's views. The first one we can get through very quickly because it's already been raised by Antti Kauppanen, whose name I've never learned how to pronounce, in his NDPR review of the book. In that review, Kauppanen writes the following. He says, "If I see that you're angry by seeing your furrowed brow, it's because your expression manifests your state. If I see a smile by way of seeing a happy countenance, it's because the happy countenance constitutes a smile. In the moral case, however, unless reductive naturalism is true, and Audi doesn't assume that it is, the moral property is consequential or grounded on the perceivable non-moral property, where being consequential entails supervenience. And the skeptic will argue that I cannot perceive F by perceiving the fact that it is consequential on. After all, it is not in general true that I can perceive a fact that supervenes on another by perceiving the base fact. I can't see that you're angry by seeing a scan of your brain activity." So the problem here is something like the following. If moral properties were constituted by or manifested by base properties, then a case for moral perception would be relatively straightforward. But given that Audi isn't assuming either that moral properties are manifested by base properties or that moral properties are constituted by base properties, Kauppanen is suggesting that moral perception is going to be much harder to defend. I raise this line of objection because I think it's an obvious one, I think it's an important one, and I think it deserves our attention. I'm mainly interested in hearing how Professor Audi aims to, or how he would like to respond to Kauppanen's objection. Myself, I don't find this to be a fatal problem. It's not clear to me that I can't see that you're angry by seeing a scan of your brain activity. I can imagine an expert in brain scans taking a look at a scan of my brain and saying, "I see that you're angry," and it's not clear to me that that wouldn't literally be true. It's also not clear to me why why the grounding relation isn't a suitable basis for perceptibility. I don't know what the relevant difference between grounding and constitution is with regard to perception. I don't know why one should be adequate and the other shouldn't be. At last year's Rocky Mountain Ethics Conference, I argued that moral perception is possible even if there is no intimate relation between moral properties and base properties. I won't repeat that argument here, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that sort of the sort of thing that I had in mind there in the general discussion. In any case, my main interest here is just in trying to find out what Professor Audi wants to say about Kauppanen. The second concern that I want to discuss has to do with moral imagination. Professor Audi discusses moral imagination in a couple of places in the book. There are on the handout I've got some quotations that are relevant to this. I think that Audi's treatment of moral imagination suggests that he would endorse what I'm calling the parity thesis. So the parity thesis says that moral imagination, this is on the handout, moral imagination, provided it is sufficiently vivid and detailed, is or can be just as good for the purpose of moral thinking as moral perception. So the thesis here is, we can spell this thesis out in terms of evidence. So we can say that my responses to imagined cases can provide a kind of evidence about morality that is just as good as the evidence that that's provided when I see a scenario in real life. So for example, to take an example that Audi uses, if I were to really observe a professor giving different grades for equally good performances, and I find that it seems to me that what the professor is doing is morally wrong, if that provides me with evidence that what the professor is doing really is morally wrong or is unjust, then that evidence is just as good as the evidence that would be provided if I were to imagine the case rather than really observe the case. That's what the parity thesis says. Now, if the parity thesis is true, then it suggests that moral imagination and moral perception are very different than perception and imagination in other domains of inquiry. So, for example, imagination and perception in moral thinking are different from imagination and perception in scientific investigation. To illustrate this point, consider a couple of cases. So these are on the handout as well. The mixing case. I watch as Joan, a scientist, mixes chemical A with chemical B, presumably using an instrument. I observe that the resultant mixture heats up, reaching a temperature of 40 degrees. In this case, I think I get some evidence that chemical A and chemical B, when mixed together, cause a heat increase. But in the imaginary mixing case, in which I imagine Joan mixing chemical A with chemical B, and in my imagination the resultant mixture heats up, reaching a temperature of 40 degrees, I don't get the same kind of evidence. I learn something about how my imagination works, but I don't learn very much about chemical A and chemical B. So for the purpose of scientific investigation, perception is much better than imagination. But according to the parity thesis, for the purpose of moral thinking, imagination and perception are on a par. So that difference requires some explanation. I think the following distinction is going to be useful in coming up with an explanation, or might be useful. So the distinction is between illustrative perception and investigative perception, and the distinction is there on the handout. Illustrative perception merely illustrates principles or other sorts of truths already known by other means in order to aid understanding. Investigative perception reveals new truths and creates or makes possible new knowledge. So, for example, if I take 2 coins, place them next to 3 coins in order to illustrate for a child, say, that 2 and 3 make 5, that's an example of illustrative perception. I'm just illustrating something that we already know. I'm not producing new knowledge. I may be transferring knowledge from me to the child, but I'm not producing new knowledge. Investigative perception is the sort of perception that we have in the sciences. When I observe 2 chemicals mixed together and subsequently observe a heat increase, that's investigative perception. Illustrative perception apparently tends not to be better than imagination. So, for example, if I want to illustrate the arithmetical truth that 2 plus 3 equals 5, I can just imagine 2 coins next to 3 coins. I don't need to really see the 2 coins placed next to the 3 coins. By contrast, investigative perception apparently tends to be better than imagination. So, again, in the mixing case, really seeing 2 chemicals mixed together is going to provide me with much better information about what happens when those chemicals are mixed together than when I simply imagine them mixed together. Given this, the parity thesis gives us reason to think that moral perception is merely illustrative perception, not investigative perception. The parity thesis says that imagination and perception are equally good for the purpose of moral thinking. Well, that's a hallmark of illustrative perception. So what we have here is an argument for the view that moral perception is just illustrative perception, and the parity thesis is a premise in that argument. Now, I want to clarify that this line of argument is not an argument for the view that moral perception never occurs or that moral perception is impossible. Rather, this is an argument for the view that moral perception, if it occurs, is not a form of investigative perception. It is merely a form of illustrative perception. This is a problem for people who are interested in making use of moral perception in the course of a response to moral skepticism. In order to respond to moral skepticism, we want to be able to show that moral knowledge is possible. And we might have hoped that moral perception would provide a path to knowledge. If we could show that moral perception provides a path to knowledge, then we would have a response to certain kinds of deeply worrying skeptical problems. But if moral perception is no more than illustrative perception, then it does not provide a path to new moral knowledge, and so does not provide us with the kind of response to skepticism that we might have been hoping for. So I, for one, am hoping that we can show that moral perception not only occurs, but is a form of investigative perception. One way to respond to the argument that I've just outlined is to argue that the parity thesis is actually false. We could argue that moral perception is actually epistemically better than moral imagination, and some people have made this argument. You hear this a lot when you're talking about certain kinds of moral questions, maybe moral questions that are especially charged with emotion. So abortion is an example that illustrates this, I think. So some people think that in order to have a well-founded view of the morality of abortion, you need to have real-world experience with abortion. You need to either have had an abortion yourself or have had to choose whether to have an abortion, or at least you need to know somebody and know them well who has had to make this choice. If you just imagine the predicament of someone who has to decide whether to have an abortion, your judgment is not going to be very trustworthy. At least it's not going to be as good as if you had real-world experience. So that's a view that some people hold. It's not a view that I find very plausible. I think the parity thesis has a lot of explanatory advantages. So for example, the parity thesis explains why it would be absurd to construct a real-world trolley case for the purpose of conducting a moral experiment. It's absurd to conduct a real-world trolley case for the purpose of conducting a moral experiment because simply imagining a trolley case provides us with the same information about morality that we would get by really observing a trolley case. So the parity thesis has some explanatory advantages, and that's one of the reasons why I find it to be plausible. So I'm not that interested in pursuing the first of the two strategies that I want to mention. The second strategy for responding to the argument that I outlined a moment ago is to argue that moral perception is investigative perception even though the parity thesis is true. In order to do this, you're going to have to show that moral perception is a kind of unusual sort of investigative perception. As I mentioned earlier, typically investigative perception is distinguished by the fact that it is better than mere imagination. So we need an account of moral perception that allows it to be a form of investigative perception, but allows it to be unusual in this respect. It allows it to be equally good as imagination. So we need to explain why moral imagination differs from scientific investigation in the respect that I've described. And I think we're going to be able to come up with that explanation. I think we're going to be able to tell a story about how moral perception works that allows it to be a form of investigative perception and allows the parity thesis to be true. But I think that it's going to be somewhat complicated to do that. I'm not going to go into my preferred story here. Maybe when we come to the discussion portion of our event, I'll say a little bit about this, but what I want to do now is just present the problem and see what Professor Audi has to say about it, and then we can perhaps return to it when we're discussing this as a group. Okay, so that's the talk. Looks like I got that done in about 15 minutes, and probably less than that because I said a little bit before I started. So I'm going to practice this a few more times and hopefully get it down to 12 minutes, maybe less. So I hope all of you are having a great summer. If you have any feedback on my talk, I'm happy to have it. Obviously, you are under no obligation to provide feedback. I know that everybody's got a lot on their plate, so if I don't hear from you or speak to you before I see you in Boulder, well, I hope you have a good couple of weeks, and I'll see all of you very soon. So thanks a lot, everybody.